caught between water and stone. A barge moved sluggishly through the mist, its lantern swinging in rhythm with the lapping current. Somewhere in the distance, a whistle shrieked from the Gare d'Orsay, echoing off the facades of the riverfront. In the heart of this brooding Paris, a strange tale was whispered. A man dead in his armchair, a book fallen from his lifeless hand, and no sign of violence beyond the stillness of the room. The notion spread quickly among the neighbours, then across the city, twisting into a darker rumour that the very book had killed him. It was just the sort of story to bring Inspector Maigret out into the cold night, his heavy overcoat buttoned high, pipe clenched between his teeth, eyes narrowed as he tried to pierce through fog, both literal and human. And before we walk further with Maigret through the shadowed alleys and smoke-filled cafes of Paris, take a moment to support this journey into mystery. A simple gesture, liking this story, sharing it with those who love such atmospheres, and subscribing for the next steps, ensures that these echoes of Simenon's world continue to breathe here. The morning broke over Paris with a haze that softened the outlines of the rooftops, leaving only the chimneys stark against the pale sky. From the Boulevard Saint-Germain came the distant hum of carts and footsteps, though in one apartment the silence was of another order. A caretaker had noticed the shutters closed longer than usual, the milk bottle untouched, and after much hesitation had called in the concierge. The discovery was simple, and yet so uncanny that whispers spread like the smoke curling from the baker's ovens below. A man sat in his armchair by the window, slippers on his feet, a book fallen open upon his chest. His eyes were half closed, as though drowsy from reading. But the stillness was absolute. The air of the room was faintly sour, not with decay, but with the lingering scent of kerosene from a lamp that had burned itself out. By the time Inspector Maigret climbed the narrow staircase, the news had already drawn a knot of neighbours into the hall. Their whispers ceased as soon as his heavy figure appeared, pipe in hand, his dark overcoat buttoned up to the throat. He did not speak immediately. He had that way of entering a place and letting it adjust around him. The concierge, red-faced and eager to be useful, bustled to explain how the gentleman had not been seen since the evening before. Maigret only nodded, brushing past with the weary patience of one who had heard such accounts 100 times. Inside, the room bore the marks of quiet habit. The furniture was worn but well kept, the curtains heavy, the carpet flattened, where slippers had tread the same path for years. On the small table beside the chair, a cup of coffee had cooled into a skin of grease, untouched. The book itself, its leather cover cracked and softened by use, lay where it had slipped, from the reader's hand. Maigret bent, not to touch it, but to study it as one studies the posture of a body. The title was obscured by the fold, but a slip of thin paper protruded between the pages, its edge yellowed and curling. The doctor summoned by the police had little to say. Heart failure, perhaps. The man was in his 60s, of a sedentary life, with no sign of struggle. Yet Maigret, leaning in the shadowed room, sensed something that resisted the neat closure of natural death. He lifted his eyes to the shelves lining the walls. They were full, almost oppressively so, of books whose bindings were dusted yet orderly, suggesting both passion and solitude. The air held the faint musk of paper that had slept long in such company. The only intrusion was that slip of paper peering from the dead man's final volume. He did not remove it then. Instead, he asked the simplest of questions. Who was the man? The concierge supplied a name, Louis Caron, retired clerk from a provincial notary's office, widowed, without children. He had lived here 10 years, punctual in his habits, polite but distant. The neighbours added their scraps of observation, that he kept to himself, that he smoked late into the night, that sometimes voices were heard, as though he spoke to visitors unseen. One swore she had heard an argument weeks ago, muffled but heated, followed by the slam of a door. Another recalled the faintest smell of burning paper from his chimney when the rest of the quarter had been asleep. Maigret listened, not for facts but for tones. He watched their eyes, how they glanced toward the door of the apartment, as though it had suddenly become dangerous. He knew the scent of unease when it hung heavier than smoke. He dismissed them gently, asked Lucas to note their names, and remained behind when the body was removed. Alone in the dim room, he sank into the chair opposite the one where death had settled, tamped his pipe, and allowed the silence to press against him. There was nothing overt. Yet the atmosphere was wrong. Death from heart failure rarely leaves behind a trail of whispers, nor does it drape itself so theatrically over a book. He rose and crossed to the writing desk, its surface clear, save for a blotter and an inkstand. In the drawer lay neat bundles of correspondence tied with string, none recent, most official. No letters of friendship, no traces of family ties. Karen had been a man of habits and solitude. Yet what man of such habits receives visitors at strange hours, or keeps slips of paper hidden in his books? At last, Maigret returned to the fallen volume. He drew out the slip of paper with careful fingers. It was a torn page, not from the book itself, but from another source, thin, almost tissue-like, with handwriting cramped across it. The ink had faded, but not with age. It had been hurriedly written, the strokes uneven, the words broken, as though in agitation. He could not read them fully in the dim light, but the impression was unmistakable, a message slipped into the book, not by accident, but by design. He replaced it quietly, for he had learned that haste in such moments can cloud the shape of a case before it has time to form. When he finally stepped back into the corridor, the neighbours had dispersed. Only the concierge remained, wringing her hands. She asked if it was true, the rumour already swelling that the book itself had poisoned the man. Maigret gave her a look both patient and dismissive. Yet he understood how such tales take root. In the fog of uncertainty, imagination grows like mould. By evening, the cafes along the boulevard would be alive with the story, embroidered and twisted, each telling sharpening its strangeness. He descended the stairs slowly, pipe smoke trailing him, as though reluctant to leave the presence of something unfinished. Outside, Paris was awake now, the fog lifting to reveal the morning traffic. Maigret paused at the corner, watching the people pass, clerks with portfolios under their arms, women with baskets, a boy delivering telegrams. Life moved indifferently past the doorway, where a man had died with a book upon his chest. Yet, to Maigret, the indifference itself was a clue, the world ignoring what it did not yet understand. He buttoned his coat, turned his collar up against the chill, and made his way toward the Quai des Orfèvres, where reports awaited and the day's work pressed forward. But even as he walked, the faint image of that slip of paper, half hidden in the pages, tugged at his thoughts like a whisper, refusing to be silenced. The case had not yet spoken, but Maigret felt it gathering around him, patient and insistent. The reader who never woke had left behind more than a body. He had left a silence that demanded to be broken. The rain began by mid-morning, first a mist clinging to the stones, then a steady drizzle that glazed the pavements and turned the gutters into small rivulets. Maigret stood at the corner of the Boulevard Saint-Germain, collar turned up, watching the droplets bead on the brim of his hat. The city seemed subdued, the carriages and motor lorries moving more slowly, the pedestrians huddling under umbrellas. He smoked without hurry, the pipe an extension of his patience, while his thoughts circled back to the slip of paper hidden in the dead man's book. He had not yet unfolded it in the harsh light of the office. Instead, he allowed the idea of it to mature as one allows wine to breathe before tasting. The path led him inevitably to the bookshops, those quiet warrens tucked between cafes and tobacconists where the air was thick with dust and ink. Karen had been a man of routine. His books showed not only passion, but dependence. It was natural that a shopkeeper somewhere knew him, knew his tastes, his hesitations, his secrets. Maigret chose to begin with the closest, a small establishment wedged between a cordonnier and a café with steamed windows. The bell above the door tinkled softly as he entered, and the warm fug of old paper enveloped him like a blanket. The proprietor emerged from the back with the hesitance of a man unused to visitors before noon. He was slight, balding, with spectacles perched precariously, and he blinked at the inspector's bulk as though at an unexpected intrusion. Maigret did not announce himself immediately. Instead, he wandered the narrow aisles, trailing his finger along spines, inhaling the faint perfume of leather bindings until the man could bear the silence no longer. "May I help monsieur find something?" The voice was polite, yet edged with a wariness Maigret had come to recognize in those who lived among secrets. "A man named Carroll," Maigret said, turning finely. "He bought books here, did he not?" The shopkeeper adjusted his spectacles. "Carroll? Yes. A regular. He came often, usually in the evenings, always very precise in his choices." "What did he buy?" The man hesitated, glancing toward the shelves as though the titles themselves might betray confidences. "Nothing extraordinary. Histories, essays, the classics. He preferred older editions. Never novels, curiously enough. Said they wasted time." Maigret studied him, the way the fingers worried at the edge of his apron. "And yet he died with a novel in his hands." The words landed with weight. The shopkeeper shifted, muttered something about tastes changing in old age, but Maigret sensed the deflection. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, letting the pipe smoke curl between them. "Did he ever buy second-hand? Volumes without provenance?" A pause too long. The shopkeeper licked his lips. "Sometimes. A man of limited means must choose carefully." It was then Maigret withdrew from his pocket the slip of paper he had taken from Carroll's last book. He did not hand it over, but held it where the shopkeeper could glimpse the cramped writing. At once the man stiffened, his gaze darted to the door, then back, and a sheen of perspiration gathered at his temple. "Do you recognize this hand?" Maigret asked softly. I sell books, Inspector. I do not examine every scrap tucked inside them." "Then you admit it was placed there before Carroll purchased it?" The silence that followed was more eloquent than confession. The rain tapped steadily against the window pane, and the muted rumble of a passing omnibus filled the pause. Maigret let the moment stretch, his heavy presence filling the narrow space until the shopkeeper sagged as though under its weight. "It was nothing," the man whispered finally. "Just a note. Harmless." "Harmless," Maigret repeated, the word curling with irony. "Yet a man is dead." The shopkeeper raised trembling hands. "But not by the note. Surely not. He came here often. Sometimes he received messages. I thought nothing of it. A lonely man, perhaps an admirer, perhaps politics, or one hears things." "What things?" Again that glance toward the door, as though shadows lurked outside. "There are circles, Inspector. Men who meet quietly, who exchange pamphlets, writings that do not please the censors. Karen, he asked for certain volumes, out of print, dangerous to stock." I warned him. The inspector said nothing. He knew that in Paris of the early 1930s, words could be as lethal as weapons. Pamphlets, clandestine tracts, ideas whispered in cafes at midnight. These were the tinder that could set lives alight. "Who brought the notes?" he asked finally. I never saw their faces clearly. Always late, always quick. A book left, a book taken. Karen paid more than the price of paper. Maigret pocketed the slip again. He felt the pulse of the case deepen, moving beyond the confines of an old man's solitude. Yet he did not press further here. Fear had sealed the shopkeeper's mouth, and to break it open too soon would scatter more than it revealed. He left with a polite nod, stepping back into the drizzle. The street glistened like black lacquer, the reflections of lamps shimmering on the wet stones. Across the way, the cafe was alive with the steam of wet coats and the hiss of the espresso machine. Maigret entered, choosing a table by the window where he could watch the bookshop door. He ordered a calvados, the apple spirit warming him as he settled into the rhythm of waiting. Hours might pass in such fashion, yet he never considered it wasted. The city revealed itself in fragments, the hurried step of a messenger, the nervous glance of a woman under her umbrella, the shifting silhouettes inside the bookshop as customers came and went. At length a figure appeared, tall, hunched, with a hat pulled low. He entered the shop with furtive haste, remained only minutes, then emerged with a volume clutched tightly. Maigret's eyes followed him down the boulevard, noting the careful avoidance of puddles, the quick glance over the shoulder. He rose, paid his glass, and followed at a distance. The rain had lessened to a fine mist, enough to blur outlines without obscuring them. The man walked with the air of someone accustomed to shadows, weaving through alleys, doubling back at corners. Yet Maigret, with his heavy stride and pipe smoke trailing, followed without haste, as inevitable as the fog that rolled from the Seine. At last, the figure disappeared into a modest pension near the Rue de l'École de Médecine. Maigret paused across the street, studying the worn façade, the dim light leaking from the lobby. He knew such places, cheap, discreet, where names written in the register often concealed more than they revealed. He did not enter yet. Instead, he let the man vanish into the warren above, storing the address in his mind as a hunter marks a trail. The rain had stopped by then, leaving the air damp and metallic. Maigret turned back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, his thoughts heavy but clear. A dead man with a book, a slip of paper with hurried words, a nervous bookseller, and now a shadowed lodger in a cheap pension. The pattern was forming, though still faint, like ink bleeding slowly into paper. He tamped his pipe, lit it anew, and walked on, the glow of the ember briefly illuminating the mist around his face. Somewhere behind these details lay the truth. Whether it belonged to politics, passion, or something darker, he could not yet tell. But the shadows at the bookshop had spoken, and Maigret knew he would follow their whisper until it led him into the heart of the city's silence. The rain persisted into the evening, drumming against shutters, streaking the glass of tram windows, and laying a sheen across the zinc rooftops of Paris. From the Quai des Orfèvres to the furthest arrondissement, it gave the city a single voice, a low, steady murmur that rose and fell like the tide. Maigret felt it most acutely in the cafes, those havens where Parisians sought warmth and company, where the clink of glasses and the hiss of steam tried in vain to drive back the damp that seeped through walls and coats alike. It was here, amid the rain-battered streets and smoke-filled interiors, that the inspector set his patient trap. He had long known that whispers do not travel along straight lines. They circle, they echo, they gather in corners like stagnant water. To follow them, one must sit and wait, blending into the background until tongues loosen. And so he chose a modest establishment near the Rue de Boutsy, a place where students, shop clerks and workmen mingled in equal measure, each drawn by the promise of cheap wine and the illusion of fraternity. He entered quietly, his overcoat heavy with rain, his pipe already darkened but unlit, a presence that filled the room without asking permission. The proprietor greeted him with a nod. Maigret had been here before, enough that his bulk no longer caused alarm. He settled near the back where he could see the door and the street beyond. A glass of white wine was placed before him, thin and sour, but it served its purpose. He did not drink much. He simply waited, watching the condensation run down the bottle, letting the rain outside mark time. Voices carried in fragments, broken by the clatter of cutlery and the scrape of chairs. Two men argued over politics, their tones sharp, their words blunt. A woman laughed too loudly at something whispered in her ear. And near the counter, half obscured by the steam from the coffee machine, sat a young man with restless hands, turning a cigarette between his fingers, but never lighting it. Maigret's gaze lingered on him. There was a nervousness about the boy, the way he started at the door, the way his eyes darted to the corners whenever the bell above tinkled. At last, another figure entered, shrugging off the rain with practised ease. He was older, his moustache neat, his overcoat better cut than his surroundings warranted. He greeted the proprietor with a familiarity that bespoke long custom, then crossed directly to the young man. Their hands touched briefly, not in greeting, but in the discreet passing of an envelope. The boy slipped it into his pocket as though it were a mere trifle. But Maigret, watching through the smoke and steam, saw the tension ripple through his shoulders. He lit his pipe then, slowly, deliberately, drawing the flame so that its brief flare illuminated his face. The older man noticed, his eyes flicking toward the inspector with the faintest shadow of recognition. But he said nothing. He ordered a cognac, drank it in 2 measured swallows, and left as abruptly as he had come. The boy remained, his hands trembling now as he fumbled with his cigarette. Maigret rose, his bulk moving quietly between the tables. He did not confront the boy directly. Instead, he paused beside the counter, speaking a few low words to the proprietor about the weather, about the endless rain, about nothing at all. Only then did he turn, resting a hand on the back of the boy's chair, leaning down just enough that his presence loomed. "You'll choke on that cigarette if you don't light it," he said, voice mild but edged. The boy startled, nearly dropping it. I wasn't—" Maigret sat opposite him without asking, the chair creaking under his weight. He puffed his pipe once, letting the smoke curl upward, then fixed the boy with a gaze that softened only at the corners. "You knew Carol," Maigret said. The boy swallowed. "No." "Then why does your hand shake when I say his name?" For a long moment the rain outside filled the silence. Finally the boy spoke, his voice low, hurried, as though words themselves might betray him. "I only brought him things, papers, nothing dangerous." "Nothing dangerous?" Maigret repeated, the irony curling like the smoke from his pipe. "And yet he is dead." The boy's eyes widened. "Not because of me, I swear it, I never—" He broke off, glancing toward the door, toward the street where the rain still fell in silver sheets. "I don't even know what was in them. I was told to deliver, that was all." "By whom?" A shake of the head. Fear clamped his lips tighter than any lock. Maigret recognized the futility of pressing further now. The boy was not lying. He was too raw, too frightened to invent. He was only a messenger, a pawn in a game he barely understood. But pawns, in their stumbling, often reveal the shape of the board. Maigret leaned back, his pipe glowing. "Listen carefully. I don't care about your errands, but if you wish to live long enough to smoke that cigarette, you'll tell me when and where your next delivery takes place." The boy stared, torn between terror and relief. At last he whispered a street name, an hour, a café near the Gare de Lyon. Maigret nodded once, rose, and left him to his trembling. Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle. The lamps glowed yellow through the mist, reflecting on the cobblestones. Maigret walked slowly, the brim of his hat dripping, the city unfolding before him in all its damp, restless mystery. He had no illusions. The boy was expendable to those who used him. The next delivery might be nothing, or it might be a thread leading straight into the heart of whatever circle Karen had stumbled into. Either way, Maigret would be there, as steady and immovable as the river that bisected the city. That night he wandered further from café to café, listening. In each he found the same pattern: hushed voices at the edges, quick glances over shoulders, the scent of fear mingling with tobacco and damp wool. The rain outside became a chorus, steady and inexorable, urging him deeper into the labyrinth. He did not yet know where it would end, but he felt, with the slow certainty of instinct, that every drop falling on Paris carried him closer to the truth. And so he walked on, his pipe glowing in the shadows, listening to the conversations in the rain. Yet the storm had thinned by dawn, leaving the city damp and raw, its pavements gleaming as though newly varnished. Maigret moved slowly along the Rue de l'École de Médecine, collar up, pipe stem clenched at an angle, his heavy steps unhurried but relentless. The night before had yielded fragments, an envelope slipped to a trembling boy, a whispered rendezvous near the Gare de Lyon, but nothing yet had settled into shape. He had spent the early hours in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, sifting through reports, his gaze drifting often to the rain-smeared window. Caron's death had begun to attract attention beyond the neighbourhood. Already the papers hinted at strange circumstances, and Maigret knew that rumours once printed grew teeth sharper than facts. A new lead had emerged, not from the boy's confession, but from the concierge of Caron's building. She had spoken of a woman glimpsed once or twice at his door, a silhouette against the dim gaslight of the stairwell. Not a relation, not a servant, not anyone the neighbours recognized. And so, late in the morning, Maigret found himself outside a modest apartment house, overlooking a narrow courtyard, its windows lined with geranium pots drooping from the rain. He climbed the staircase, the banister sticky beneath his palm, the air smelling faintly of boiled cabbage. At the second floor he paused, pipe unlit, listening. From behind one door came the faint scratch of a chair on the floor, then silence. He knocked once, heavily. After a pause, the door opened a fraction, revealing a woman in her 40s, her face pale, hair pinned in haste, a cigarette trembling between two fingers. "Madame Roche?" Maigret asked, his voice neutral. She nodded, though warily, and opened the door enough to admit him. The flat was small, tidy in the way of those who guard appearances as if they were currency. Lace curtains hung before the window, filtering the pale daylight. A faint trace of perfume mingled uneasily with the acrid smoke of her cigarette. She gestured toward a chair. "I don't know what you want from me, Inspector. I've read the papers. But I hardly knew Caron." Maigret sat, settling heavily, his eyes sweeping the room without haste, the sewing basket tucked beneath a table, the stack of unopened letters on the mantel, the ashtray crowded with half-smoked cigarettes. He drew out his pipe, tamped it deliberately, but did not light it. "You knew him well enough to visit?" Her eyes flicked toward the window, then back. "Once or twice. He asked me to lend him some books. I have a cousin who works at a publisher's. Which books? She hesitated, crushed the cigarette into the ashtray. Pamphlets. Nothing important. Maigret leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. Pamphlets are rarely unimportant, madam. A silence followed, broken only by the distant clatter of a cart in the courtyard. She lit another cigarette, inhaled deeply and exhaled with a shudder. You don't understand. He was frightened, not of death, of discovery. He said someone watched him. He asked me to keep certain papers for a time. I refused. Because you were afraid? Her laugh was short, bitter. Wouldn't you be? Men vanish in this city for less. I'm a widow. I have nothing but this flat and a small pension. I couldn't afford to be involved. Maigret studied her face, the fine lines etched more by anxiety than age. She was telling part of the truth, but holding the rest close, as though the words themselves might summon danger. He tried another angle. Did you love him? The question startled her. She looked at him sharply, then away, the smoke from her cigarette forming a shield. Love? No, perhaps pity. He was so alone, but he spoke little of himself. Only once did I hear him raise his voice when a visitor came late at night. I couldn't see who it was. They quarrelled. I heard the door slam. Did he mention a name? She shook her head. Only that they had betrayed him. I didn't ask more. It was none of my affair. Maigret rose, his bulk filling the small room. He walked to the window, looked out at the damp courtyard where laundry sagged on a line. He turned back, pipe between his teeth. Madame, if you know more than you say, silence will not protect you. On the contrary, it will draw danger nearer. Her hand trembled as she stubbed out her cigarette. There is one thing. A letter. He asked me to post it if anything happened to him. I told him no, but he left it here, hidden in my sewing basket. I was afraid to touch it. She rose, fetched the basket, and lifted a folded envelope from beneath the spools of thread. Her hands shook as she offered it. Maigret took it carefully, noting the scrawled handwriting, the uneven seal. He slipped it into his pocket without opening it, aware that the act itself carried weight. Did anyone else know of this letter? No. Only me. And now you. He gave a single nod. Then forget it was ever here? She exhaled, a long breath of relief and fear mingled. For a moment her shoulders sagged, the tension of secrecy released. Maigret watched her, then turned toward the door. As he stepped into the corridor, she called after him softly. Inspector, do you think the book really killed him? He paused, looked back, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Books don't kill, madame, but the stories they contain sometimes do. He descended the stairs, each step heavy, his thoughts already on the envelope in his pocket. Outside, the air smelled of damp stone and coal smoke, the city shaking itself awake after the storm. He lit his pipe at last, the glow flaring against his face, and began the slow walk back toward the river. The case no longer belonged solely to Karen and his solitary habits. It had spread into the lives of others, messengers, booksellers, widows, and each step revealed another strand of a web whose center remained hidden. The woman at the window had given him more than a letter. She had given him proof that Karen's death was not an accident of age or heart, but the culmination of secrets too heavy for one man to bear alone. As Maigret crossed the Pont Neuf, the wind lifted the last drops of rain into his face. He squinted into the distance, where the towers of Notre Dame loomed through the mist, ancient and impassive. Somewhere in the city, the truth waited, crouched in shadow. He would find it, patiently, inexorably, as he always did. But for now, the letter in his pocket burned like a coal, promising both revelation and peril. The train slid from the Gare d'Austerlitz at mid-morning, its whistle scattering pigeons from the roof as it pulled slowly into the fog. Maigret sat alone in a compartment, hat tilted low, the rhythmic clatter of wheels beneath him a steady pulse that left room for thought. On the seat beside him lay a telegram, brief, impersonal, but insistent. It spoke of Karen's earlier life in a provincial town, a place where he had left more than papers and debts. It was the sort of lead that could not be ignored. The inspector tamped his pipe and stared at the condensation streaking the window, watching Paris recede behind him like a dream one cannot quite shake. The countryside unfurled in slow monotony. Wet fields bordered by thin poplars, small villages crouched against the grey sky, a solitary horse standing motionless in the mud. The damp clung to everything, even inside the compartment, where Maigret's breath fogged faintly. He let his thoughts circle around Caron, not the quiet man of Saint-Germain, surrounded by books, but the younger version he had been here, in this provincial town, whose name was scrawled across the telegram. What ghosts would greet him there? At last the train slowed into a station so modest it seemed embarrassed by its own existence. The platform was nearly deserted, save for a porter stamping his feet against the cold and a woman with a basket of eggs. Maigret descended heavily, his coat collar turned up against the damp air. The town stretched beyond the station, a scatter of red-tiled roofs, a church spire blackened with soot, narrow streets slick with rain. It smelled of coal smoke, damp earth, and something faintly acrid, the residue of lives lived without hurry. He walked to the nearest café, the kind with lace curtains yellowed by tobacco smoke, where the stove gave off more smell than heat. The locals glanced up as he entered, their eyes narrowing briefly at the stranger's bulk before returning to their glasses. He ordered a glass of red wine and let the silence draw out until the proprietor, a man with a heavy moustache and an apron that had seen better days, asked where he was from. "Paris?" Maigret said simply, his voice flat. The word carried weight. Conversation around the stove faltered, then resumed in lower tones. Everyone in the room knew why a Paris inspector might come here, though none would say it aloud. Maigret nursed his wine and let the silence work on them, his gaze lingering on the raindrops crawling down the window. At length, a man at the stove cleared his throat. "You're here about Carol, aren't you?" The question was not hostile, merely resigned. Maigret inclined his head. The man spat into the fire. "He left this town 10 years ago, and good riddance. He thought himself better than the rest of us, always writing, always talking in riddles, never joining the others at the café. People said he had debts, others said worse." "What worse?" Maigret asked softly. The man shrugged, eyes fixed on the stove. He meddled. In politics, in affairs that weren't his. He knew things about people, things he shouldn't. Some said he blackmailed, others that he merely collected secrets, but it amounted to the same. Nobody trusted him. When he left, no one wept. The proprietor leaned on the counter, his expression sour. He had enemies, that much I can tell you, men whose names mattered here, but it was easier for everyone when he disappeared to Paris. Maigret listened, puffing quietly at his pipe, absorbing the bitterness that still clung to Caron's memory. These were not merely provincial grudges, they were scars poorly healed. A man does not become solitary by chance, he is pushed into solitude by the weight of those who resent him. He asked about family, none. Friends, none worth naming. Lovers. A silence, then a few chuckles, quickly stifled. Karen had been alone here, as in Paris. But the laughter told its own story. Loneliness had not been his choice, but his fate. Leaving the cafe, Maigret wandered through the streets, boots echoing on the wet cobbles. The town had the feel of a place waiting for something that never came, its shops half empty, its people glancing out from behind curtains. At the mairie, he examined old records. Caron's employment as a notary's clerk, his abrupt resignation, his departure without ceremony. The mayor's secretary, a sharp-eyed woman with ink-stained fingers, remembered him vaguely as a man who asked too many questions and smiled too little. By late afternoon, Maigret stood in the cemetery on the edge of town. The rain had ceased, but the ground was sodden, and the air smelled of moss and stone. He walked among the tilted headstones, reading names weathered by years. Here was Caron's wife, buried long before he left the town, her grave marked by nothing more than a modest cross. No flowers, no signs of recent visits. Maigret stood a long while, pipe smoke drifting, imagining Caron returning here alone, the silence pressing on him like a shroud. A caretaker approached, cap in hand. "You're looking for Caron, I suppose?" Maigret nodded. The old man spat into the grass. "He came here often, at night. I saw him sometimes, standing by that grave. Never spoke, never prayed, just stood there. Once I heard him mutter about betrayal. His wife, he said, had known too much." The inspector's gaze lingered on the grave. He thought of the envelope now in his desk drawer, the one left with Madame Roche, sealed against disaster. A man who mutters about betrayal at his wife's grave, who surrounds himself with books and hidden notes, does not die peacefully of a failing heart. As the evening train bore him back toward Paris, Maigret stared out at the darkness rushing past, the reflection of his pipe ember flickering in the glass. The provincial town had given him echoes, nothing more, but echoes that hinted at a pattern. Caron had been marked long before his solitary death in Saint-Germain. He had carried old grudges, old debts, old secrets into the city, and there they had ripened like fruit left too long in the damp. The rhythm of the wheels lulled him into a heavy calm. He felt the case expanding, the circle widening. What had begun as a quiet death in an armchair was now a shadow, stretching from Paris into the provinces and back again, touching lives that would rather forget. Somewhere in that stretch of shadow lay the truth, and Maigret, pipe between his teeth, would not rest until he had walked its length. The Gare d'Austerlitz spat Maigret back into Paris with the weary hiss of steam and the shuffle of travellers returning from their provincial errands. He stepped down heavily, the brim of his hat low against the drizzle that had resumed, as though the city itself had waited for his return, to cloak him once more in its damp embrace. The crowds moved about him, purposeful and oblivious, but Maigret's stride was unhurried, his bulk cutting a patient path through the press. The envelope left by Madame Roche was still in his desk at the Quai des Orfèvres. He had resisted the temptation to break its seal. Yet each hour that passed seemed to increase its weight. He knew instinctively that when the time came to read it, the case would shift upon its axis. For now there were other threads to follow. It was Lucas, faithful and methodical, who brought him the next one. In the inspector's office, as the coal fire hissed and spat, Lucas placed a notebook on the desk. "A name," he said simply. "One of Caron's." We checked the registers. Maigret drew the notebook closer. The handwriting was neat, precise. He read aloud, "Charles Martin, room 12, Hôtel de l'Avenir." The inspector raised his brows. "An alias, of course." Lucas nodded. "He stayed there 3 nights last winter, paid in cash, came and went at odd hours. No visitors, according to the night clerk." "According to?" Maigret murmured, puffing his pipe. He shut the notebook and rose, his overcoat already hanging from the peg. Come, Lucas. A hotel register never tells the truth, but it whispers enough lies to be useful. The Hôtel de l'Avenir was tucked into a side street off the Boulevard de Sebastopol, a narrow facade squeezed between a shuttered bakery and a cheap clothier. Its sign swung creakily in the damp wind, the paint peeling, the gilt letters dulled by soot. Inside, the lobby smelled of damp carpet and old tobacco. A single gas jet hissed on the wall, casting shadows across a counter polished by decades of elbows. The clerk, a sallow man with thinning hair, looked up nervously as Maigret entered, his pipe smoke filling the confined space like fog on the Seine. The inspector gave his name without flourish, and the effect was immediate. The man's shoulders sagged, his eyes darted to the register lying open on the counter. "You had a guest here," Maigret said, his voice heavy with patience. "A man who called himself Charles Martin." The clerk hesitated. "We keep no secrets, Inspector. Everything is in the register." "Registers lie," Maigret replied and drew it toward him. The pages were filled with the cramped scrawl of dozens of hands, each name and address written in varying degrees of haste or caution. Charles Martin was there, room 12, the handwriting neat, almost too neat, the kind that tries too hard to be ordinary. When did he arrive? December, coldest week of the winter. He had only a small suitcase. And how did he spend his nights? The clerk spread his hands. "We do not pry. He came and went, sometimes after midnight, always sober, always polite." Maigret's eyes narrowed. "Polite men with false names are the most dangerous kind." He shut the register and turned to the stairwell. "Room 12?" The clerk nodded, pale. Lucas followed as Maigret ascended, his steps heavy on the worn treads. The corridor smelled of dust and old wallpaper paste. Room 12 was near the end, the door marked by a brass number dulled with fingerprints. The clerk produced a key reluctantly. Maigret unlocked the door and entered. The room was bare, its narrow bed neatly made, the wallpaper peeling in one corner. A washstand stood against the wall, its basin cracked, a pitcher half filled with stale water. The window looked onto the opposite wall of the alley, so close one could almost touch the bricks. It was the sort of room that swallowed secrets whole. Maigret stood still, pipe in hand, letting the air speak. He could sense Caron's presence lingering, not in objects, for the room had been stripped bare, but in the faint orderliness of the space, the way the chair had been tucked just so, the bed frame polished by use. A man had lived here with intent, however briefly. Lucas searched the corners, running his fingers along the edges of drawers, tapping the skirting board. At last, beneath the lining of the washstand drawer, he found a scrap of paper, folded small. He handed it to Maigret. It was a fragment of a receipt, torn and smudged, bearing the name of a café near the Gare de l'Est. No date, only a scribbled note in a hurried hand. "Tuesday, as arranged." Maigret slipped it into his pocket, the ember of his pipe glowing briefly. "He met someone here," he said. "This room was no refuge, it was a rendezvous point." Back in the lobby, he lingered at the counter, questioning the clerk with quiet persistence. At last, the man admitted that Martin had once received a visitor, a tall figure, cloaked, arriving late at night. They had spoken in low tones in the room for nearly an hour before the visitor left, face shadowed by his hat. The clerk had not asked questions. One learns not to in such places. As Maigret and Lucas stepped out into the drizzle, the inspector drew his coat tighter around him. A false name, a rendezvous, scraps of paper hidden in books and drawers. Caron lived half his life behind curtains. Lucas asked, "Do you think the visitor killed him?" Maigret shook his head. "Not yet. But whoever that man was, he carried part of the story, and part of Caron." They walked toward the boulevard, the wet cobbles shining under the lamplight. The café near the Gare de l'Est would be their next stop, a place where clerks and travellers mingled, where the clatter of suitcases might drown the whispers of conspiracy. Maigret felt the case deepen around him, each clue not clarifying but widening the circle. A hotel register, a café receipt, a sealed letter waiting in his drawer. They were not answers, but echoes, calling him further into the shadows. And as he walked through the misty Paris night, Maigret knew that Caron's death was no longer a solitary affair. The city itself was beginning to hum with rumour, with the tension of truths half-spoken, with the weight of secrets pressing at the doors of cheap hotels and dim cafes. The inspector's pipe glowed steadily in the dark, a small ember of certainty against the tide of silence. By the time the following morning's edition struck the kiosks, the case had already slipped beyond Maigret's grasp in one sense. He had expected whispers in cafes, gossip in stairwells, murmurs between porters and concierges, but not this. Bold headlines stamped across damp sheets of newsprint, hawked by boys with inky fingers who shouted through the rain. The book that killed a man, mysterious death in Saint-Germain. The inspector collected a copy from a kiosk on the quay, the paper smelling of wet pulp and printer's ink. The headlines sprawled across the top in block letters, sensational and careless. Beneath, the article unfurled with all the half-truths of an overzealous reporter. Caron had been found dead with a book upon his chest. Neighbours swore they had heard quarrels and seen strange visitors. A widow confessed to having feared for her safety. The slip of paper tucked between the pages was already transfigured into a note of poison, though the journalist admitted no expert had confirmed it. The article ended with a flourish suggesting secret societies, clandestine politics, even curses. Maigret crushed the paper beneath his hand, irritation simmering behind his calm expression. He had learned long ago that rumour is more dangerous than fact. Once printed, it spread faster than any investigation, shaping witnesses' memories, guiding suspicions, planting fears where none had been. By evening, half the city would repeat the tale as gospel truth. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the commissioner raised his brows as Maigret laid the paper on his desk. "You see what they make of it? A cursed book. If the prefecture receives more letters, you'll be sent explanations to write instead of inquiries to pursue." Maigret puffed slowly on his pipe, gaze steady. "Let them write. We'll follow the smoke to the fire. A rumour tells us who wishes it believed." And so he left the building, overcoat collar high, and followed the trail not to suspects, but to newspapermen. Near the Rue Réaumur, where presses roared like mechanical beasts in their lairs, he entered the cramped office of Le Cri Parisien, the very paper that had carried the headline. The newsroom smelled of ink and sweat, desks cluttered with sheets, typewriters hammering like hail against tin. The editor, a wiry man with nicotine-stained fingers, looked up as Maigret loomed over his desk. "Inspector, an honour. We meant no harm, only public interest." "Public interest?" Maigret's tone was quiet, heavy. "Or private invention?" The editor shifted uneasily, offering a cigarette. The inspector declined. "We had a tip, a neighbour who spoke freely, a woman who hinted. We embellished, perhaps. But the people read such things." Maigret bent closer, the ember of his pipe glowing. "Who gave you the detail of the slip of paper?" The editor hesitated, then shrugged. "It reached us anonymously, a note left at the desk. No name, only the story." A story, Maigret thought, seeded deliberately, planted like a weed among facts so that truth itself might be strangled. He left the office without further words, the editor wiping sweat from his brow. Outside, the press still thundered, sending fresh sheets into the city. The cafes were alive with the rumor by afternoon. At the corner of Boulevard Saint-Michel, Maigret entered a smoky room where students argued heatedly over politics, their voices rising above the scrape of violins from a phonograph. He sat at a table in the corner, letting the smoke cloud around him, listening. "The book was poisoned, they say," one student declared, pounding his fist on the table. "A foreign plot, mark my words, the government hides it." Another laughed, though uneasily. "Nonsense! It was suicide, disguised to look like something grander. The man was nothing." A third leaned in, whispering, "My uncle heard it was blackmail. Karen knew names, wrote them down, hid them in books. Someone silenced him." Each theory, Maigret noted, revealed more about the speaker than about Carol. Fear, suspicion, desire for drama, all coloured their words. Yet within the exaggerations lay kernels of truth. Karen had collected papers, perhaps secrets. He had enemies, and someone wanted the city to believe in poisoned books rather than plain human motive. Later, at a different café near the Gare de l'Est, he watched as men in work coats whispered over their beer. One tapped the newspaper, muttering about conspiracies. Another shook his head, muttering about politics and spies. The rumor had taken on a life of its own, mutating as quickly as influenza in a crowded dormitory. That night, Maigret returned to his office and finally broke the seal on the letter Madame Roche had kept. It was brief, hurried, the handwriting agitated. "If anything happens to me, seek the one who brings the book. Do not trust the shop, nor the pension. They know. I am already followed." The inspector read it twice, pipe smoke curling in the lamplight. The words did not name, but they pointed. Someone had used the book not as weapon, but as conduit, slipping into its pages a message, a threat, perhaps a secret. Karen had expected his death, or at least feared it, and had chosen to hide his fear in writing. Maigret leaned back heavily, staring at the ceiling beams darkened by years of smoke. Around him the building was quiet, save for the occasional creak of footsteps or the muffled cough of a guard. He thought of the widowed woman behind her lace curtains, the nervous bookseller, the trembling boy, the shadowed visitor at the hotel. The press had dressed the case in costume, but beneath the fabric lay flesh. Karen had been part of something larger than himself, something that had now spilled into the streets, onto the pages of every paper, into the mouths of men who hungered for explanation. When at last he rose, stretching his weary shoulders, Maigret felt the case had crossed a threshold. It no longer belonged only to him, or to Carol, or to a handful of suspects. It belonged to Paris itself, alive in rumour, twisted in ink, heavy with the weight of half-believed stories. And so, with the letter folded carefully in his pocket, he descended the stone steps of the Quai des Orfèvres and stepped into the misty night. The river slid past, dark and silent, carrying reflections of lamps that quivered like uncertain truths. Somewhere in that silence lay the answer, drowned beneath words. Maigret, pipe glowing, would wade through rumour until he found it. Paris had the deceptive stillness of a theatre before the curtain rose. To the casual eye, it was ordinary, carts rattling across slick cobbles, the metallic clang of a tram bell, children's laughter echoing in narrow courtyards. Yet Maigret, pipe clamped between his teeth, sensed the shift in atmosphere. Since the newspaper headline, his faces turned a little quicker. When footsteps approached, conversations hushed mid-sentence, shutters closed with greater haste. A city intoxicated by rumour had donned its masks, and in the inspector's patient gaze Each mask glittered with unease. The bookshops were the first stage of this masquerade. He visited them one by one, his heavy frame looming among shelves of musty paper, his silence forcing words out of nervous proprietors. Everywhere he went, he found the same dance: polite smiles, hurried denials, the practiced vagueness of those who traded not merely in books, but in information. One old bookseller in the Marais swore he had never heard Caron's name, though Maigret's eye caught the faintest tremor in his hand as he wrote a receipt. Another in Montparnasse admitted Caron had browsed there, but insisted he had never purchased anything unusual, though Maigret noted the locked cabinet behind the counter, where titles forbidden by the censors lay hidden from casual sight. At each stop the inspector collected no firm evidence, only impressions, fear disguised as courtesy, deflection wrapped in formality. The city was not protecting Caron, it was protecting itself. Books could be dangerous things when they carried not stories, but secrets, and every man who sold them learned to wear the mask of innocence. From the bookshops, Maigret moved to the cafes, those smoky crucibles where rumour grew into conviction. He took his place in dim corners, a silent bulk with a glass before him, letting the flow of talk wash over. He listened to a painter in Montmartre insist that Caron had belonged to a circle of anarchists, to a clerk from the Bourse who whispered of foreign agents slipping codes into novels, to a woman who swore she had seen Caron burning papers in his grate, his face lit red as though by flames of hell. Each story contradicted the next, but in their tangle Maigret felt the pulse of something larger, fear not of one man's death, but of what it might uncover. Paris, he thought, was like a carnival where each mask concealed a different truth. Behind laughter lay fear, behind indignation, guilt, behind ignorance, knowledge too dangerous to claim. The inspector did not confront these storytellers directly. He let them talk, let them inflate their tales, and filed away what details they let slip unguarded. A street name, a meeting place, a certain phrase repeated too often. He moved through the city with the patience of a hunter, following tracks invisible to others, pipe smoke trailing like a slow banner of persistence. One evening he followed a trail to a widow in Belleville, her window overlooking a courtyard, dark with drying laundry. She received him with exaggerated grief, lamenting Caron's death as though they had been intimate. But when Maigret pressed her, the façade cracked. She admitted she had known him only through whispered conversations in cafes where he spoke too freely about men who held positions in the ministry. "He was reckless," she said, dabbing theatrically at her eyes. "I told him he would end badly. He laughed." Yet the tremor in her voice suggested something more personal, a connection she dared not claim. Another mask, another layer of silence. The inspector returned often to Madame Roche, the woman at the window. Each visit he found her more frayed, as though the burden of what she knew gnawed at her edges. She swore she had told him everything, yet her cigarettes burned down faster each time, the ashtray filling before his eyes. He would sit across from her, pipe smoke mingling with her tobacco, watching the curtains stir faintly in the damp breeze. She spoke of neighbours, of visitors glimpsed in the stairwell, of letters slipped beneath doors, but never quite enough. She was guarding something, and Maigret knew time itself would pry it from her more effectively than questions. The masks extended even into the police's own informants, men who once dealt in whispers with ease, now hedged their words, fearing to be drawn into a story that had already filled headlines. One, a ragged fellow with ink-stained cuffs, insisted Caron had dabbled in politics but could not, or would not say whose politics. Another, usually bold in his gossip, grew suddenly cagey, his eyes darting as though others listened. They had donned their masks as well, waiting to see which way the wind blew before they committed themselves. And so Maigret moved through this city of disguises, slow and steady, unwilling to tear masks away prematurely. He had learned that a man behind a mask will often reveal more than one unguarded. It was in the gestures, the pauses, the contradictions. He collected them all, a patient archivist of deception, knowing that sooner or later one mask would slip. The streets themselves seemed complicit. The fog that rolled from the Seine blurred outlines, turning familiar boulevards into shifting theatres. Lamps glowed yellow against the mist, casting shadows that elongated and danced. From the Pont Neuf he watched barges slide beneath, their lanterns swaying, while above them men hurried across, collars high, faces half hidden. The entire city felt like a stage, each citizen an actor, concealing his lines, until cued. One night, near the Rue de Rennes, Maigret lingered outside a café long after closing, the last patron stumbling into the drizzle. From within he had overheard a scrap of talk, a name half-whispered, quickly hushed. He waited, the glow of his pipe ember steady, until a man emerged, tall and thin, with a scarf wrapped too tightly around his neck. The fellow hesitated, glanced both ways, then walked quickly toward the river. Maigret followed at a distance, his tread unhurried yet inevitable. The man led him into a labyrinth of alleys, pausing once to light a cigarette with hands that shook. At last he entered a shabby boarding house, disappearing inside. Maigret did not follow. He merely noted the address, the posture, the mask that had slipped for one instant in the tremor of a match flame. Another thread, another piece of the puzzle. By the time he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, dawn was smudging the eastern sky, turning the Seine into a sheet of dull pewter. He sank into his chair heavily, pipe gone cold, and stared at the papers strewn across his desk. Each bore traces of masks, the hotel register with its false names, the café receipt with its evasive scrawl, the letter from Caron warning of pursuers unseen. Maigret understood now that Caron's death was not an isolated crime, but a mirror reflecting the city's anxieties. Each rumour, each denial, each mask was part of a performance. But who had written the script? Who had chosen the book as prop, the slip of paper as cue? Behind the carnival of disguises, someone had orchestrated the play. The inspector tamped fresh tobacco into his pipe, struck a match, and watched the smoke rise into the dim air of his office. He had no intention of tearing away every mask. He needed only to find the one behind them all, the playwright who had turned Caron's solitude into spectacle. Until then, Paris would remain a city of masks, and Maigret its tireless spectator, waiting for the moment when truth itself would step unbidden onto the stage. The drizzle had lifted by the time Maigret reached the quay the following morning, but the city remained sodden, its pavements slick, its air heavy with the smell of wet stone and coal smoke. The inspector had slept poorly, haunted not by dreams but by fragments of voices, whispers collected in cafes and stairwells, the unfinished sentences of men who wore masks too tightly. When he entered his office, his pipe already clamped in his jaw, he found Janvier waiting with an expression that mixed eagerness with unease. "There's a man downstairs," Janvier said. "He insists on seeing you, says he's ready to confess." Maigret raised his brows, but without surprise. A confession so early and so convenient seldom rang true. He hung his overcoat on the peg, brushed rain from his hat brim, and said simply, "Send him up." The man who entered was in his 40s, narrow-shouldered, dressed in a threadbare suit that had once aspired to respectability. His hair was slicked back too carefully, his shoes shined to an anxious polish. He carried himself like one rehearsing courage, though his eyes betrayed a tremor. He sat when instructed, folded his hands, and announced, "I killed Louis Caron." The room was silent save for the faint hiss of the stove. Maigret regarded him without speaking, puffing steadily, letting the words hang. At length he asked, "Why?" The man swallowed. "He wronged me. Years ago, in the provinces. He spread lies, ruined my name. I followed him here to Paris. When I saw him in that room, with that book, I knew it was my chance. I slipped poison into his glass." His voice faltered on the last word, as though he had stepped too far onto thin ice. Maigret's eyes narrowed. "Poison, you say, and yet the doctor found none. Tell me, monsieur, what poison did you use?" The man hesitated, then muttered, "Arsenic." Maigret tapped ash into the tray. "Arsenic leaves a trace. There was none. Try again." A flush crept into the man's cheeks. He shifted, cleared his throat. "Perhaps it was another. I don't recall." "Poisoners," Maigret said softly, "always recall." The silence deepened, broken only by the distant sound of typewriters from the outer office. The man's rehearsed composure began to unravel. His hands trembled, his gaze darted to the door. At last he burst out, "It doesn't matter how. I killed him. I want it known." Maigret leaned forward, pipe smoke curling between them. "You want it known, not because it's true, but because someone wishes the story to end. Who sent you here, monsieur? Who promised you coin, or pardon, or peace if you carried this guilt on your back?" The man's lips parted, but no words came. His eyes brimmed with panic, the look of a puppet whose strings had been yanked too hard. Finally he muttered, I cannot say." "You cannot," Maigret repeated, rising heavily to his feet. "Or you dare not. That is not confession. That is theatre, and I do not applaud." He signalled to Janvier, who led the man away, shoulders slumped, rehearsed bravado dissolved. Alone once more, Maigret tamped fresh tobacco into his pipe. He felt no triumph, only confirmation. The confession had not been meant to illuminate, but to obscure, to draw a curtain across the stage just as the play approached its climax. Someone had sent that man, knowing full well the inspector would see through him. It was not the crime they sought to hide, but the connections that crime revealed. That evening, Maigret returned to the cafes, for it was there the city's pulse beat strongest. At the Gare de Lyon, where trains rattled in and out with weary rhythm, he sat in a cafe filled with clerks and porters, his glass untouched, his gaze drifting lazily. He listened. And again he heard the name Karen, spoken in hushed tones twisted into new shapes. Some claimed he had been a spy, others that he had stolen documents from the ministry, still others that he had kept a ledger of names too dangerous to expose. And now, with the false confession spreading, the patrons nodded knowingly, as though the play had concluded and the curtain had fallen. But Maigret knew the performance was far from over. He could sense the hand of the playwright, the one who had seeded rumours in the press, planted scraps in books, and now sent a man to claim guilt that was not his own. The story was being managed, shaped, controlled. And the inspector, heavy-lidded though he seemed, absorbed each gesture with relentless patience. He left the cafe near midnight, the rain beginning again in fine needles, the lamps glowing like halos in the mist. His stride carried him back to the river, where the Seine moved dark and indifferent, swallowing reflections without hesitation. He paused on the Pont Marie, pipe ember glowing faintly in the fog, and let the night speak to him. Karen had been solitary, yes, but not alone. His death had roots that reached beyond his armchair, into politics, into debts, into the city's underbelly of pamphlets and whispers. The false confession had only sharpened Maigrey's resolve. Truth did not hide behind grand gestures. It lingered in silences, in the tremor of a hand, in the hurried scrawl on a slip of paper. He would strip away each mask, not by tearing it off, but by waiting until it slipped of its own accord. When at last he turned back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, dawn was still hours away. Yet Maigrey felt the case nearing its heart. The city had played its part, the newspapers theirs, even the impostor with his hollow words. Soon the true voice would emerge, the one that had remained silent longest, and Maigrey, weary but steady, would be there to hear it. But the morning fog clung low over the Seine, swallowing the bridges until they seemed to float untethered in the whiteness. From his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigrey watched the blurred outlines of barges drift past, their horns muffled as if the river itself held its breath. He sat with his pipe unlit, the sealed letter from Karen spread open once more before him, the ink uneven and desperate. If anything happens to me, seek the one who brings the book. Do not trust the shop nor the pension. They know. He read the words again, though by now he had memorized each line. They were not a dying man's prophecy, but the echo of someone cornered, someone who had lived too long under shadow. Maigrey knew the danger of such notes. They accused without naming, they guided without direction, leaving only an aura of menace that could attach itself to anyone. And yet, coupled with the false confession of the previous day, the note pointed not to chance, but to deliberate orchestration. By late morning, he and Lucas were at the Hôtel de l'Avenir once more, climbing the narrow staircase whose wallpaper peeled in tired curls. The false name in the register, the visitor. Cloaked in the night, the receipt for the café, all had led back here. The night clerk, pale and reluctant, admitted under Maigrey's steady gaze that the tall man with the scarf had returned since Caron's death, slipping in and out without luggage, leaving no name. He had paid for silence with a handful of francs each time. Maigrey said nothing in reply. He left the hotel and walked toward the café near the Gare de l'Est, receipt in hand. The rain had slackened, leaving puddles that reflected the pale sky. Inside, the café was nearly empty, a few porters nursing bowls of coffee, a waitress polishing glasses behind the zinc counter. The inspector chose a table at the back, his pipe glowing faintly, and waited. An hour passed before the door opened and the man with the scarf entered. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being invisible. He ordered an absinthe, his voice low, his eyes scanning the room, once before settling into a seat. Maigrey rose, crossed the floor with heavy inevitability, and sat opposite him. The man stiffened, his hand tightening on his glass. "You've been following me," he said, his voice hoarse. Maigrey puffed once on his pipe, letting the smoke curl between them. "You left too many traces. A hotel register, a receipt, a clerk too frightened to keep silent. You were with Caron the night he died." The man's jaw tightened. "I had business with him, nothing more." "What business?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Books, papers. He collected them. I delivered." "Delivered what?" The man's eyes flicked away. "Pamphlets, letters. He paid well." "And the slip of paper in the book? Was that one of yours?" Silence. His lips thinned, his gaze fixed on the absinthe glass. Maigrey leaned forward. "Caron feared you. He wrote that if anything happened, it would come from the one who brought the book. That was you." At last the man looked up, his eyes sharp. "Fear? Perhaps. But he needed me. Without me, he had nothing. I brought him news, words, secrets. He lived off them, and then he asked for more than I could give, names, documents, dangerous things. I refused." "And so he died," Maigrey said quietly. The man's hand trembled. "Not by my hand, I swear it. When I left him, he was alive. He laughed at me, said he would expose me anyway, with or without proof. I thought he was bluffing. Yet the next morning he was dead." The man drained his glass in a single swallow, the green liquid leaving a sheen on his lips. "If you want a murderer, Inspector, look higher. I was only a courier. Karen meddled where he shouldn't. He thought words were weapons. Perhaps he was right. But I did not strike the blow." Maigret watched him a long while, measuring the cadence of his breathing, the sweat at his temple. He believed him, not entirely, but enough. The man was guilty of fear, of cowardice, of carrying secrets he did not understand, but not of murder. That evening, Maigret returned once more to Madame Roche's flat. The woman at the window received him with red-rimmed eyes, her hands trembling as she lit one cigarette after another. He laid the open letter on her table, the ink stark against the lace cloth. "You knew of this?" he said. She nodded miserably. "He told me he was watched. I thought he exaggerated. I thought it was his solitude speaking. But then I saw the man with the scarf leave his apartment one night. Karen's face afterward. It was like he had stared into a mirror of death. Why didn't you say this sooner?" "Because I was afraid. If Karen was silenced, what chance had I? They would come for me too." Maigret's gaze softened, though his voice remained firm. "They will not come for you, madame. The play has already ended. All that remains is for the curtain to fall." He rose, pipe ember glowing faintly in the dim room, and left her to her silence. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he dictated his final report. Caron's death would remain officially unexplained. No poison, no wound, no culprit to present in court. But between the lines of his report lay the truth he carried silently. Karen had been a man who collected too many secrets, who drew couriers and widows and booksellers into his orbit until his own solitude consumed him. Whether his heart had failed under the weight of fear, or whether unseen hands had nudged him toward the grave, mattered little now. The book had not killed him. The story within it had. That night, Maigret walked the quays alone. The fog had thickened, the lamps glowing like halos suspended in the mist. He paused at a café terrace, the chairs stacked, the tables slick with rain, and drew deeply on his pipe. Paris breathed around him, smoky, damp, alive with rumour and silence. He thought of Carol, the reader who never woke, and of the countless others whose lives ended not with violence, but with secrets too heavy to carry. The river moved steadily at his side, indifferent and eternal. Maigret exhaled smoke into the mist, the glow of his pipe a small, steady light against the city's darkness. He knew the case would fade from the papers soon enough, replaced by fresher scandals. But he also knew that beneath the masks, beneath the rumours, beneath the stories men told to hide themselves, Paris would always carry such secrets, and he, weary yet unyielding, would always be there to listen when they broke the silence,